to make us silent. At this point, you have to understand there is still a total cover-up. There is no public mention of these rape gangs by politicians or media. As I've showed you, I started highlighting these rape gangs in 2004. The Times newspaper. When I started the English Defence League, I wore a mask and I used a pseudonym because I was fearful of the consequence of speaking about these things. In 2010, the Times newspaper sat down, they knocked at my door and said, "We are unmasking you as the leader of the English Defence League." This was my first public interview I'd given since starting the organisation. I spent 4 hours detailing the reasons we were angry, detailing the rape and prostitution of our daughters. I'll read you an extract from this interview in 2010. "His claims are extraordinary. Muslims sell heroin as chemical warfare to weaken British society, as well as enticing drug-addicted British girls into paedophilic prostitution." I continued, "There's an undercurrent of anger from people living in towns like this. It's ready to explode. The government need to listen. Before we started, the working class across this country were ignored by the government. We are bringing these issues to the forefront. They would have ignored us for another 10 years if we didn't do anything. If the politicians aren't going to stick up for us, we will make them, because we will cause so much fuss and so much noise that they're going to have to listen. We will not back down or be beaten into submission. We don't care if you call us racist, we're coming anyway. We will continue doing it until someone listens." At this point, the establishment have tried intimidation. They've tried arrests. It hasn't worked. Now they face a big problem because quite clearly we're telling them we're not backing down. The value of our children is more important. The world's media were attending our demonstrations where thousands of men and women screamed in the streets demanding action. You've seen our banners from demonstrations. I then began being invited onto mainstream TV channels. As you'll see now, this is the biggest news channel in the UK.
If I ask you, do you know anyone that's hooked on heroin sold to them by Muslim gangs? You probably don't, I do. Do you know any beautiful girls that you went to school with that are now wearing a burqa that don't see their family? Probably don't, I do. Do you know anyone who's been murdered by a Muslim gang? You probably don't, I do. Do you know any 15-year-old girls that you know that you've grown up with that have been raped or pimped? You don't, so I don't expect you to understand the issues.
These are all personal issues of yours.
Personal issues in towns and cities like mine that are happening, and they're not happening with the Sikh community, they're not happening with the Jewish community.
And indeed, they're not happening with most Muslims.
No, they're happening within the Islamic community. This is what I'm saying, that it's an Islamic problem. And when I'm just a simple person, so I'm just a normal person, but when I'm looking at, I have to look for where this hatred is coming from.
As you could talk about members of the white community doing all sorts of atrocious things.
Yeah, but not 24-year-old groups of 10 of them hanging around outside school gates.
You've never seen a white gang?
And purposely targeting.
Never seen a white gang?
Are we going to pretend that Muslim groups are not out there purposely targeting our youth and pimping them? Are we going to pretend it's not
You're
happening?
not pretending white people aren't doing that?
Then not in the same manner, not in the same group. They're saying it's a cultural thing which is going on within their community. And no one dare say it. Look, I sat and watched Question Time, and when I watched Question Time, all I could see our political leaders was trying to explain that Jack Straw could have dressed it up a little bit better, and talking about these girls like they're statistics. They're not statistics. These girls are... Well, whose daughters do you think these are? Whose sisters? They're ours, in working class towns and communities. And people are fed up of what's going on, and it is being ignored. For 20 years, our councillors and the leaders from the Islamic community have conspired with the police to not deal with Muslim pimping gangs. So don't waste your money. The government are going to waste their money doing an in-depth investigation into these Muslim paedophile gangs, yeah? Don't waste your money. Do an in-depth investigation into the Quran. All of this hatred has got to be coming from somewhere.
They realise there's no hiding this now. With this pressure, the spineless police force began to act. I'm going to show you a graph now. This is a graph that shows the arrest rate. You'll see the line change. In the first 18, there was 18 arrests in the 11 years before the English Defence League formed. When the English Defence League forms, the next year, there's 36 arrests. Twice as many as the previous 11 years. You can see the graph go straight up, where these problems are now being tackled. When I started the English Defence League, there was a court case for these rapes every 60 weeks. Now there's a court case every 6 weeks. Andrew Norfolk is a journalist for the Times newspaper. He is the man who is accredited with exposing this rape scandal. When he spoke about it, he called it a grooming scandal. But here's a newspaper article from 2010, before any Andrew Norfolk expose. This is Andrew Norfolk reporting on an English Defence League demonstration, because he'd come to our demonstrations, he'd heard our speeches. Remember, I sat down with this same newspaper the year before, telling them claims which they called extraordinary about child prostitution rings. In 2011, he was the first journalist to say what we had been saying. Revealed conspiracy of silence on UK sex gangs. He essentially repeated what I told him the year before in his own newspaper, the extraordinary claims. He'd repeated what he'd heard in our speeches. But I'm not going to tell you that the English Defence League forced Andrew Norfolk to report on it. I'll leave that to him.
7 years after shelving a potentially explosive story, journalist Andrew Norfolk found his conscience calling him.
As the years went by, I had this very uncomfortable feeling I hadn't done my job.
Demonstrations were sweeping across the country, led by the emerging face of the far right, the English Defence League. Its members were young, organised, and growing in numbers, and its marches often descended into violence.
Gas grenades were thrown, police vehicles were vandalised, and the police themselves were attacked.
The EDL's goal was to stem the growth of a faith that it believed was corrupting the country. And in the grooming of white children, they saw not just a crime, but evidence of a broader Islamic agenda.
Militant Muslim gangs taking liberties in our towns and cities, taking liberties with non-Muslim youth, non-Muslim girls, raping, pimping, beating, abusing our whole system.
I sense a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, justified anger, justified frustration. We are a community that has been let down by our politicians, let down by the leaders of our police forces. There has been a conspiracy of silence by police leaders, Islamic leaders and politicians to facilitate the orchestrated rape for 20 to 30 years of members of our community.
The squeamishness of the liberal establishment, and that includes the media, national politicians, police forces, social services, in actually confronting what was going on, left a void, and into that void marched the EDL. It had become quite personal for me. There was a sense of actually reclaiming this story from the wrong agenda, the far right's agenda, and putting it squarely where it should have been all along.
Taking it back from the far right agenda. By far right, he means us. He means the English Defence League. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and rape victims. But you don't need to listen to me tell you that. I'm going to introduce you now to a victim who was one of the 1,400 children that were raped in Rotherham. She'll explain who was attending our demonstrations.
A lot of the people going on these marches, you know, I know some that are victims, that are families, just normal kind of working day people that are just so angry at what's happened. They feel they're not being listened to, they're being ignored, and that the system is corrupt. And they're looking, you know, to go on movements like this because they feel that's the only way that their voices can get heard.
He spoke about the English Defence League's agenda. Our agenda was a cry for help. Every time we went on the street, we cried for help to the authorities to stop this religiously motivated mass ethnic rape happening in our country. I thank Andrew Norfolk for being the first liberal elite to speak out on this issue. But his headline was Conspiracy of Silence. He was part of that conspiracy of silence. He admitted himself in that video. He'd known about these gangs for 7 years, but was too scared to report on them. Now he's finally reporting the truth that he knew. How many children were raped in those 7 years? That journalist won Journalist of the Year, whilst we were labelled far-right, racist extremists. I'm now going to show you a map of every town and city in the UK that has had the prosecutions for these gangs. I could stop and tell you a horror story of every single town and city. I simply don't have time, so I'm going to stop at 2 towns and cities that we have the figures for. But what you'll